is Saturday Agenda.
G'day and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm David Lipson. Well, for decades, Australian universities have punched above their weight, but according to recent studies, they're slipping, losing ground in particular to China. So the government is reportedly looking at ways to change the way tertiary institutions in Australia are funded. According to News Corp papers this morning, the government will this week make the case for a shift towards the US-style college system of tertiary education, opening up $6 billion in Commonwealth grants to private sector competition. Currently, that money, those grants, are only available for public sector institutions. Well, joining me now to discuss this and the rest of the day's issues are my, Harvard-educated political panel. The Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Josh Frydenberg, is in Melbourne, and the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Dr Andrew Leigh, joins us from Canberra. Thank you both very much for your time on Saturday Agenda.
Pleasure, David. Nice to be with you, David.
First to you, Josh Frydenberg. We know that Harvard is a great university, but we also know that most people in America can't afford to go there. Is that the sort of system we want here in Australia?
We certainly want public funding for our universities, but these stories today stem from the recommendations from an inquiry commissioned by Christopher Pyne by two very well-respected higher education experts, namely David Kemp and Andrew Norton. There's two important points to make here, David. Firstly, we are a party of deregulation and a party that encourages competition. And if we can do that in the tertiary education space, for example, by providing more support for TAFEs, then we'll do that. The second point is that we firmly believe in the higher education space as a means of lifting Australia's productivity and economic growth, and indeed the health of our overall nation. And we have over 1 million university students in Australia. 70% of those are domestic, 30% are international. But under the Labor government, we saw dramatic cuts to higher education. In fact, more than $2 billion was ripped out of that space. And Australia was ranked a pitiful 25th out of 29 countries in the OECD in terms of public contributions, public funding contributions to universities. So we want to see greater investment in our university space, but we also want to see our universities freed up from the shackles that currently constrain them to ensure that they can compete on the international stage. And as you pointed out, David, we are falling behind. Out of the top 300 universities in the world, in a recent ranking where there were 7 Australian universities, they fell behind in the most recent rankings. So we've taken notice of that. We're listening to the university and tertiary education sector, and we're going to produce some reforms which will enhance our position in the world.
Andrew Leigh, you had to go overseas to get the education that you wanted. Why not try and set up a system like that here in Australia?
Well, David, I'm glad we're talking about quality higher education. I greatly enjoyed my 4 years at Harvard, but also really enjoyed the 6 years I spent as an academic at the ANU. I think boosting the size of the system has been absolutely vital. Josh there cutely referred to a 2% efficiency dividend near the end of our term. What he didn't refer to was the fact that there was a 75% increase in overall funding to universities under Labor. And we did that by predominantly taking the caps off university places, deregulating, if you like, in order that we could increase the number of students going to university. It's easier to run a system where you've got the top 10th of the class going to university than the top half of the class going to university. But we know that the latter is the right way of doing things in Australia, because the boost to going to university is so great for your earnings and your productivity. Probably a 50% boost, certainly according to research I've done in this space. Do we want to then look at deregulating? Well, we've got 2 private universities in Australia, one named after Mother of God, the other after a convicted criminal. And I've got friends teaching at both of them. I think they're both good institutions. but I'm not sure you'd look at the entire Australian university sector and say that really what we need is to take it down a private route. What we've got to do is to maintain those high quality standards in a system which doesn't just pick 1 in 10 kids, but actually takes close on half of the graduating high school students in Australia. We need more kids going to university
you're the Shadow Minister for
boost
competition. Why not in this space?
We have a great deal of competition in Australian universities, David, and one of the things you've really seen over the last decade is more kids going interstate to study at universities. That's a feature of the American system, and where about 1/3 of students study out of state, and I think it's a good thing to see here in Australia. The question in my mind, though, is whether you want to go down the private institution route, which really works in the United States because of such a huge degree of private philanthropy. The US is off the map in private philanthropy, perhaps because it's also off the map in terms of small size of government. And so if you go for the private model but you don't have the philanthropy, then I'm concerned that students could be left worse off.
Josh Frydenberg,
I really want the coalition to hold up quality.
Josh Frydenberg, it'd still be the same, presumably, pool of funding available. $6 billion is what's there currently, which means that if there was more money for private institutions, there'd be less for the public institutions. Could you, or the government, guarantee that uni fees in public institutions wouldn't then go up in order to meet the difference?
Well, David, let's wait and see the budget in terms of the details of any announcements from the Minister and from the Treasurer. But, I mean, the key point here is we're trying to build competition, we're trying to encourage innovation. We do believe that private universities can play an important role in Australia. They're not to substitute the role of publicly funded universities, but the point is we want to encourage both systems at the same time. Labor ripped money out of the higher education space. We want to put extra money in, and we want to do that to ensure better productivity outcomes.
What do you mean by extra money in? You're saying that the budget for tertiary institutions will be increased?
Well, there was some reports today in the papers about some additional funding. We're looking
$250 million, yeah.
Well, let's just wait and see what the budget said. But the point is this is an important review by David Kemp and Andrew Norton. It's going to have a series of recommendations around the demand-driven system. And we have to acknowledge that Australian universities have fallen a bit behind their international counterparts, particularly the ones in Asia. And that's not a good outcome, so we do need reform.
All right, well, moving on, I want to look at direct action. The white paper was handed down this week. That is, of course, the government's policy on dealing with climate change. Still committed to getting rid of a price on carbon. That remains stalled in the Senate, but we are seeing more detail now on direct action. $2.5 billion is the amount of money that will be available for a reverse auction, which means that the companies that can demonstrate they can reduce carbon emissions at the lowest cost will have access to some of that government money. It doesn't look, though, like this will get through the Senate, even if Clive Palmer's 4 votes go the way of the government. The independent in South Australia, Nick Xenophon, for one, wants to see substantial changes to what he's seen so far. In particular, he wants to see penalties for any polluters that show a spike in their carbon emissions. Josh Frydenberg, does this need to get through the Senate? Does there need to be legislation on direct action?
Well, Greg Hunt, the Environment Minister, has said that is certainly his preferred option, and we believe we have a mandate from the Australian people at the last election for our direct action model, and it's a considerable amount of money that we're putting forward to help us meet the Coalition's commitment to reduce emissions by 5%. On 2000 numbers by 2020. So it's an important program. We'll engage in constructive discussions with Clive Palmer and the other independents. As you say, we've released this white paper. It followed a green paper and more than 290 submissions that were considered by government. So a lot of work has gone into this area. It is a market-based system. I think that is important to point out, and it can make a real difference to emission reduction. So we're hopeful that Clive Palmer and the other independents will come on board after they've had time to digest the white paper and to discuss the detail of the policy with Greg Hunt.
One of the problems with the policy, though, is that companies that have spent time and in particular money making their businesses more efficient and less emitting of carbon dioxide, they don't have access to any of this money. They're, you could say, penalised for having acted early. What's your response to that, Josh Frydenberg?
Well, we've been very upfront in terms of our policy well before the last election that we were going to scrap the carbon tax. We believe it penalises families, it penalises businesses, big and small, and it makes Australia an outlier compared to the rest of the world, because no other comparable economy has an economy-wide carbon tax like Australia. And it hasn't actually reduced emissions, that's the key point. So it's extremely costly. It was a grand bargain by Julia Gillard and the Greens. So we said we're going to get rid of it. Now, if companies made arrangements based on the carbon tax, that obviously was understandable in the context that that was the legislation the Labor Party passed. But they also knew very much so that this is our policy, which is to scrap the carbon tax and to put in place a direct action scheme.
Andrew Leigh, if the government does get its way after July and scraps the price on carbon, what would you rather see in its place? Nothing, or the direct action policy?
Well, David, it's a close-run thing, isn't it? Because, as Malcolm Turnbull noted just after Tony Abbott beat him in the leadership poll, direct action is really just a fig leaf, a way of pretending you're doing something about climate change without actually acting. Australia currently has a carbon price, not an economy-wide one, Josh is making that up, covers about 60% of domestic emissions, excluding agriculture and transport. And it's already working to reduce emissions, as you'd expect. I mean, every serious economist backs carbon pricing over command and control, which is really what you've got when you look at direct action. And when you look at that direct action report, the figure you don't see in it is the cost per tonne abated. And that's because direct action is, of course, much more expensive for reducing carbon pollution. It's a scheme which taxes householders in order to give to polluters, rather than a scheme that puts a price on carbon pollution. I mean, do we really think that the right price for a tonne of carbon pollution in Australia at the moment is zero? We ought to go from a system in which we're saying to people, we're going to put a modest price on carbon pollution, a system which businesses have adjusted to, a system indeed which the Chinese communists think is perfectly reasonable.
But that is what the people voted for at the last election. And just returning to my question, you know, if it does turn out the way we would expect it to turn out after July, that the carbon price is gone, that's you know, what the government says it has a mandate to do, and if it is gone, what will Labor do? Will it try and block the introduction of direct action, which Greg Hunt says will easily reduce emissions by 5% by 2020? Will you block that, or will you allow it through? Is something better than nothing, is my question.
David, you're really putting a classic Sophie's choice there to me. My hope instead is that people like Clive Palmer and Nick Xenophon are able to put pressure on the government to hold to the carbon price. We know this is a carbon price that Labor would support going to an immediate floating price. That would reduce the price by around 2/3. So if you want the fixed price period gone, Labor will back that from July 1. You'll get a 2/3 fall in the price, but you'll still get that effective, efficient reduction of Australia's emissions, in the way that Conservatives in Britain and New Zealand have done, all around 30 countries around the world, which are using carbon prices to steadily reduce emissions.
Okay.
Kick the can down the road, gets very expensive in the 2020s to start putting in place real action.
All right, a quick break here on Saturday Agenda. We'll be back looking at the proposed changes to pensions and other areas that the budget may be cut back in a few weeks' time. Stay with us.